Hello, friends. So here's my attempt at episode number 2 of NICU Nuggets. Yay! I figure I have to get a few videos at some point so people will actually watch, right? I can't imagine they would watch an empty channel. So today I have a couple of things I was going to talk to you about. One of them is the thing that's on everyone's mind, which is COVID-19 and how that's relating to babies. And in sort of a tangent, I'm going to talk about vitamin K, which is different, but again, tangentially related. I'm looking for a segue. So first, everyone take a deep breath. Don't panic. It's been scary. It's scary for professionals as well as just your regular lay people. Of course, everything with COVID is dynamic and we're still learning more every day. But in the last week or so, there's been some developments that have been of real concern for the neonatal world. I'm not going to give you a lot of background on COVID because it's kind of a big deal. I think you've heard of it already. But largely, COVID is a disease of big people, which is people I don't treat. It's the highest risk for this is among people who are older and they can talk and walk and tell us what's wrong. But there have been some children who have been sickened with COVID, and there have been cases of people testing positive or infants testing positive. So I think everyone in the neonatal world is very relieved that our patients are not being affected directly by COVID. We get affected by the shortages, but not by the disease itself so far, knock on wood. So this follows the same path or a similar path as SARS and MERS, which were both coronaviruses as well. They didn't really affect babies either. Again, thankfully. That doesn't mean they never could or they couldn't have a mutation or something like that. But as of now, we haven't seen it. In the last 5 days, though, there have been 2 case reports of infant death. The first one was in Illinois, for which we have no information about, including age, other conditions, details about the death. And the other was just reported today. A 6-week-old infant was brought in, dead from home, and tested positive for COVID postmortem. We again have no details on other health issues this infant might have had or circumstances surrounding the death. This is all speculation on my part. I'm not treating any of these patients, and I don't know anything about them except for what I read in the newspapers, just like you. And by newspapers, I mean the internet. There are a lot of people getting scared and sometimes wound up about these cases. And at least at this point, I am very skeptical that the infants died of COVID, but I think it's more likely that they died with COVID, which is a super important distinction. For example, 6 weeks old is pretty much peak SIDS time. And when I hear of a 6-week-old being brought in who has passed away from home, my first thought is SIDS. So it is very possible that that infant died of SIDS, and when they swabbed the infant postmortem, the infant was positive. And remember, we can't tell if it's an active infection or not just from a PCR test. That's just looking for little itty bitty bits of the virus. And you can sometimes have those bits of virus in your body even when you are not actively sick or actively contagious. This is going to rely on the infant's history and whether they were sick prior to death and what the autopsy finds. Being positive for COVID on a swab is different than histologic samples that clearly show virus invading tissue. So if the autopsy comes back and it shows that the lungs are full of COVID and they were damaging the lungs, then we have a different situation. But we don't have that yet. The other child that we know no information about is just that they're tested positive and that they are unfortunately dead and that they were under 1 year old. But we don't know the specifics on age, other conditions they may have had. And again, autopsy is going to be absolutely important for this. If this was a 9-month-old infant who had chronic lung disease of prematurity and was on a home vent, I'm going to feel a lot differently than if it was a 6-month-old infant who had upper respiratory symptoms and then got worse and died at home. Those are very, very different situations. That's basically the adult path, and it's possible, but unlikely. Or is this a child who had something like severe combined immune deficiency, or AKA SCID, or bubble boy disease? There's just really a lot of factors that come into play, and it's important to not assume things before we have the real information. Overall, I'm trying to hold on to my freak out until the autopsies are back. With the history of other countries not having neonates affected and SARS and MERS not really affecting neonates, I tend to think that there's more likely that it was other complicating conditions that they died with and not of COVID. There's always a possibility, though, that one of the mutations of COVID could increase the lethality for neonates. I'm just super skeptical about that right now. The reason for this is simple. For whatever reason, COVID hasn't been affecting babies. And that's either because of something intrinsic in the immune function of the infant or in the virus itself or the interaction between the two. It's always possible that the virus could mutate, but that would likely affect adults too in some way, because it's not like viruses are super targeted that way unless someone was purposely manipulating them, which they're not. Please don't start conspiracy theories about that. Nobody's purposely manipulating the COVID. And the other option would be a difference in the babies. So I guess it's possible, but it's unlikely that a difference in baby would be out in the population. That difference in baby could be those other complicating conditions that might affect the immune system. So I know there's a lot of investigations going on into these cases, and I certainly hope the results will be shared with us when they're known. But in the meanwhile, I'm going to try and keep calm and not freak out. I suggest you do the same. And it might just be an outlier, because outliers happen. You know, an outlier is something that is sort of a freak accident. You know, you have a 1 in a million shot of having something happen, and it happens to you twice. You're an outlier. Kind of relating to outliers, that's going to segue into vitamin K, one of my favorite topics. That's not true. All of my topics in neonatal are kind of my favorite topics because I love babies. So I'm going to talk about vitamin K now because it has an outlier. That's sort of a fun fact, and I like trivia. And because it's just a really important topic to cover. Vitamin K is one of the first things your baby receives after birth. Well, except love. In the NICU world, it's part of what we call eyes and thighs, which means eyes are erythromycin ointment for the eyes, which help prevent blindness in case you were exposed to an STI and you weren't aware of it. And thighs refer to where we give vitamin K shots, which is in the thigh. I'm not going to go into the eye goop, which is the erythromycin for now. Maybe another video. Vitamin K, though, it is incredibly important. No matter what gestation the baby is, what condition they may have, if it's just everyone needs it. Why? Because it provides the necessary building blocks for your body to be able to help clot their blood. Babies have immature blood vessels, just like everything else in their body, because they're immature. And birth is a physically traumatic event. Moms have a slightly lower than normal clotting levels because the risk of developing a clot in your placenta is really bad. And it can cause death of the fetus or other malformations. So you have a baby being literally forcibly pushed through a very small opening in comparison to the baby. And it's so much force that their bones rearrange, which is why you see the cone head sometimes. And that puts them at a risk for bleeding. It just does. I would like to see you try it and not have any bleeding and bruising either. Really, no. I don't want to see you try to be birthed. That wouldn't work. So when a baby hemorrhages after birth, it is called, or it used to be called, hemorrhagic disease of the newborn. Now it has been renamed to vitamin K deficiency bleeding, or VKDB. I have never personally seen a case of it, and I would like that to continue, but it used to be more common and something people would see several times in their career. It comes in 3 flavors: early, which happens in the first day or so of life, and that's usually with moms who are on warfarin or other medications that affect vitamin K. Classic is the most common form, and that happens anytime between day 2 of life and between 1 to 2 weeks of life. That is a little more likely to happen in the bleeding in the gut, but it also can bleed into the brain, the skin, the kidneys, and none of it's super good. Obviously, the brain is the worst. Late onset is more rare than the classic, but it is also typically very devastating. There's usually no warning. There's sometimes with the classic, you can have little bleeds first with some oozing of like the umbilical cord or the heel stick, but there's usually no warning with the vitamin K disease bleeding deficiency, vitamin K deficient bleeding for late onset. And in up to 60% of cases, the bleeding happens in the brain. And if I haven't mentioned it before, we like brains. We don't want brains to go away because we can't replace brains. If you lose your brain, that's all she wrote. And brains don't come back as easily as other organ systems. So it's really important to do everything we can to preserve brains. We're not zombies, I promise. So the risk of it is overall low. For the classic form, it's probably under 2% of every baby that's born and doesn't get a vitamin K shot. Late onset is even more rare. It is 0.00007% of babies who don't get vitamin K. And I hear you, that's a really low likelihood. But if it happens to your child, it's a 100% for them. And if there was a simple, low-risk intervention that you could do to save your child's life and their brain, it seems like a no-brainer, pardon the term, to do it. Because let's do that, right? So in the US, we give vitamin K by IM injection. I know some European countries give oral vitamin K, but I'm going to talk about a little bit why that's not as good. So we have 3 main routes of administration: parenteral, which is IV or intravenous. That's when things go directly into your bloodstream. Enteral, or oral. That's when things go through your mouth, into your stomach, through your intestines, past your liver, and then into your bloodstream. And then you have IM, which is deep into your muscle, and then it is slowly absorbed by your body in the lymphatic system and then redistributed. There's also sub-Q, but we're not going to worry about that. It's more similar to IM. So it's all of these different routes have different concerns and different risks. If you give oral medications, they're affected by what's called first pass, which is going by the liver already before it goes to your body, because because it goes directly from your intestines to your liver and then out to your blood, which can lower the effectiveness of it. But it also tends to have the fewest side effects because it's less in your body. IV is typically the most effective of most drugs, and it also typically is the one that has the most risks and side effects because it is going directly into your bloodstream, straight to your body, all your tissues, without stopping and pass and go. And it definitely doesn't stop by your liver first. It will eventually get to your liver, but it's affecting you before it goes there. And IM is, and sub-Q are kind of in between those. It's definitely not as fast as IV, but it's nowhere near as slow as oral. And the side effects are just different. So that's important to keep in mind because the two types of vitamin K, or we'll talk about 3 types: oral, enteral, which is enteral, parenteral, and IM. So oral vitamin K is also very low risk, but they have found that oral vitamin K has failures. Babies puke, parents forget. There's lots of things that could affect it. Or if they have something that's going on with their gallbladder or liver that hasn't been diagnosed yet, that could affect their absorption of it. So that's why the United States doesn't do oral formulations. We don't currently have an oral formulation available. And part of the reason is because we wouldn't give it anyway, because if you give it IM, there is zero failure. It doesn't fail. And if you give it orally, there is a failure rate. And there's been several papers on this where once places have switched to oral, they start seeing, and especially the late onset vitamin K deficiency bleeding, which is in some ways the most horrific. So that increased risk is why we don't give oral vitamin K. We don't give IV vitamin K for 2 reasons. 1, more risk of side effects, which I'll go into in a little bit. And 2, I don't want to put an IV in every baby. That seems overkill. IM is a great way to administer this. It's very low risk. So the first thing you'll usually hear is black box warning, which is what they all freak out about. Now, that shows an overall lack of understanding of what black box warnings are and what their goal. Black box warnings are designed to be triggers for a prescriber to think of potential side effects or problems that they could have. You can see a black box warning on oral iron supplements like children's vitamins. There is a black box warning on Tylenol. Both of those things are things that can be dangerous if given in large enough quantities. And really the point of a black box warning is just to bring the eye of the prescriber to something that is high risk so they can go, oh, I've already accounted for that. This is okay. Or, oh, maybe this is too much risk for this particular case. So the black box warning for vitamin K is for anaphylaxis, which is the fancy word for allergic reactions. Now, there's 2 parts of that. Number 1, typically the anaphylaxis is seen with intravenous, IV, or parenteral administration of vitamin K. That's administered to grown-ups. They get it when they have liver problems, I guess. Whatever, I don't do grown-ups. But we don't have that. We don't typically give that to our patients. We do occasionally if they need it. And when we do that, we follow the same precautions as adults, which is prescribing anti-anaphylaxis drugs. But babies are unique and they are not just little adults. And you'll hear me say this a lot because it's one of the mantras in neonatal medicine. So babies have to learn how to do everything, including their immune system. And part of what they are learning in their immune system is learning what belongs to them and what belongs to outside. So self, not self. Things that cause anaphylaxis are not self. Things that don't are self. Babies don't recognize that very easily because they used to be living in someone else's body. So it was really important that their body didn't recognize things that weren't identical to it as not self. It kind of gets turned off while they're in utero because otherwise it would cause a lot of problems. And because of this sort of unique ability, it gives babies some really fun little traits. So like if you give a bone marrow transplant in the right window frame of time, they can sometimes completely engraft that bone marrow transplant and not need anti-rejection meds because you gave it to them in the period in which they didn't know the difference between self and not self. And by the time they were starting to learn it, they assumed that that bone marrow was their own. I just think that's super cool. The other part of that is they just can't mount anaphylaxis. They just can't. They don't have the immune system to do it. It's not part of their repertoire. And yet I bring up outliers. So I am exceedingly intellectually honest to an annoying point at times. So there has been only one case ever recorded of anaphylaxis with vitamin K given IM to an infant. And it was so unusual, it was written up in a journal because that's what we do when something happens and we've never seen it before. Write it up and share it with others. So this baby was given the typical IM dosage of vitamin K and had symptoms of anaphylaxis, which they reversed. It's fairly easy to reverse. And infant recovered completely without any negative side effects or anything like that. It was just really weird. That is what is called an outlier. So we have been giving vitamin K to babies since the mid-40s. So we have given millions, if not billions, of vitamin K doses. And there's one, anaphylaxis. The odds on that are way better than the odds of vitamin K deficient bleeding. And that's why vitamin K is so important. It's not really a concern for our babies. And if it happens, vitamin K is given in a hospital and we can reverse it. It's that simple. So don't worry about the black box warning. If you're not prescribing a medication, the black box is not for you. That's not what it's for. Let's see. What's another thing they usually crow about? Jaundice. I know that's one of the things. And there were some initial studies that showed jaundice, but that was with the vitamin K that they gave in the 50s, I believe. That was a much higher dose. I think it was 50 milligrams to 100 milligrams, but it way higher. It's never been recorded since we switched to the current dosages we use, which are 1 milligram and a half milligram, which is dependent on how big the baby is at birth. So we have shown that without giving a massive overdose of vitamin K, we do not have increased risk for jaundice or kernicterus. So we've taken that concern off the table. I've also heard a lot of them, they say that it makes the blood thick. It doesn't. That's not the way clotting works. So I know it's complex for people who aren't medical necessarily understand what we call the clotting cascade. The way I kind of like to explain it is it's like ingredients to make a cake. So you've got baking powder and flour and sugar and eggs and oil, and you have to mix it all up, and then you get a cake. And if you forget one of those ingredients, the cake isn't going to turn out right, and that's going to be a problem. It's probably not going to taste very good either. So vitamin K is like one of those ingredients in the cake. Alone, it's not making your blood thicker. It's not cake. It's not clotting. It doesn't do anything. It's just a vitamin in your body. But when it's mixed with all of these other things in the clotting cascade, your clotting factors, your platelets, your fibrinogen, all of those things, it allows you to clot. It doesn't make you clot. It allows you to clot. Again, an important difference. So it's not making your blood any thicker than it would have been normally. I find it somewhat ironic that a lot of the people who are against the vitamin K shot are very into delayed cord clamping, which is a good thing. I mean, we do that for all babies now. That is a standard of care in neonatology. Well, technically it's OB, but for neonates, that is the standard, is delayed cord clamping, ideally 60 seconds, depending on what the baby's condition is. And that actually can change the viscosity of the blood. I have had to, I've seen exchange transfusions. We have to literally just take out blood and give them saline in response because their blood, they have too many red blood cells, and it makes the blood really thick and it doesn't move through the blood vessels very well, especially the little itty bitty capillaries. And so the baby can sometimes have trouble breathing. It can cause problems in the brain and just other issues of perfusion. So thickening the blood is really far more of a risk with delayed cord clamping. The risks are not as many as the benefits, but vitamin K does not change the viscosity of your blood at all, any more than adding baking powder to a cake mix or a homemade cake mix isn't changing the viscosity of that cake mix. It just means that when you put it all in the oven, your cake's gonna rise like it should. Let's see. Oh, preservatives. That's another big one that people talk about. So the vitamin K that we give babies doesn't have preservatives. Why? Because the preservatives are dangerous. We know that. Saline syringes that like every hospital uses a billion of them each day. There's different ones for babies, and we would never use an adult saline syringe because saline syringes for adults have preservatives. We don't use those for babies. I believe it's a benzoate alcohol. I know it's a benzoate. Can cause gasping syndrome, which is not great. It's a respiratory problem where they can't get enough air because it's affecting how the body processes oxygen. But we don't give it to people because that disease is a risk. So we don't give it. Preservatives, not a concern. There was a study done in, I think, the 70s, maybe the 80s, that showed a slightly higher risk of leukemia. There have been a shit ton of studies after that, and they have not been able to reproduce, say hi to the cat, the increased risk of leukemia. That was just a flawed result. There is no increased risk of cancer with a vitamin K shot. It's unnatural. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's made from plants, so it's still not natural. But yeah, you're not born with it. But that kind of goes back to a little bit with the COVID stuff, is that nature doesn't care. It doesn't care whether you specifically survive. Evolution doesn't care whether you specifically survive. They only care that the species survives. And if you have reproduced, as in you're having a baby, you have fulfilled your evolutionary duty as far as nature is concerned. So it doesn't even really care if the baby lives as much. And the rates were low enough that the birth rate would be able to compensate for it in history. But nowadays, we like to try to prevent our babies from dying, just as a matter of course. I mean, they would have loved for it to be avoided back then too, I'm sure, but we couldn't do it. We can now, so we should. There's also some weird thing about people thinking that it prevents stem cells from crossing the blood-brain barrier. There's no research to support that, and usually that goes along with the viscosity thing. So I don't know what kind of sort of science that they're trying to use on that, but it's not an issue. Pain, yeah, it's an IM shot. It can make the baby sore, but it's just a single prick, and it's over pretty fast. And if you nurse or give sucrose, which is sugar water, they have done studies that show for things like injections, it is as effective as morphine. Don't you love babies who can use food as morphine? So those are the biggest concerns with vitamin K that I've heard. If you've heard other things that you're worried about, please let me know. I can probably debunk those too. Because vitamin K is incredibly safe. I've also heard some people say that we give, like 20,000 times the normal dose. We don't. I mean, maybe in the 40s we did, but not since I've been a practitioner. It's just, we give a 0.5 milligram to premature babies who are under 1,500 grams. And then we give a full milligram to big babies. But that's it. It's not that exciting, but it is super exciting to have your baby not die. I am always in favor of babies not dying. This will be a theme on my channel. Babies shouldn't die, ideally. That doesn't mean that there's no such thing as a good death and that we sometimes can't save everybody, but if there's easy things that we can do to prevent death, we should do it. And vitamin K is one of those easy things that we can do. A single shot, and you have taken away your baby's risk of bleeding into their brain, their intestines, and other parts of their body. It is magic almost. Some of these things that we've discovered for neonatal are just amazing when you think about it. It used to be that, up to 2% of babies would die from bleeding after birth before this. And now with single IM injection, we've completely removed that risk. Oral drops, as I said, they help somewhat, but there have been failures. And so the IM version is fail-safe. And with something that is as important as your baby's brain, I think it's a better idea to use something that doesn't have any rate of failure. It just protects. So please, 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 please accept the vitamin K shot for your baby. I promise you, it is safe. It is effective. It is one of those amazing little interventions we have developed that saves lives. So let us save your baby, please. If you have, like I said, if you have other questions about vitamin K or anything else neonatal that you'd like to see me talk about, please let me know and I will see if I can do it. And someday I will actually have some sort of intro and or production value, but I'm still learning and I'm old. And in case you missed it, that's my kitty cat. Say hi, Annie Beanie. She's not sure why I have the video on, but she likes to be with me while I do it. She's just usually out of the shot. And one of these days it'll be less windy so I can actually go outside and be heard. So take care, wash your hands, socially distance, don't go out if you don't have to, and take care of yourselves.